Andor is over, and with its conclusion, wraps up one of the last few great projects Disney Star Wars had going for it before this whole revamp of how they're going to do things.
Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks.
Previous Star Wars films presented the Empire as this grandiose figure, emphasizing its size, power, organization as a means to intimidate the much smaller Rebel Alliance. And this is, of course, not too surprising. George Lucas has always been upfront about the fact that the rebels are meant to represent the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, that they are these small guerrilla forces resisting the influence of a much larger superpower.
They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
Lucas drew from anti-war sentiments of the 70s when making his movie originally, but he also drew heavily from the imagery of Hitler, a military force that's put together, assembled, and adhering to the ideology of a singular Übermensch, a singular figure of great intimidating power and authority. However, when you're watching Star Wars, the first trilogy at least, you may get a sense that none of these military officials and all these guys are all that valuable, because the film focuses mainly on Darth Vader as the avatar of the Empire. And as a result, you might forget, hey, there's a whole bunch of other people in this Empire too. There's much more to the Empire than just Darth Vader and the Emperor. There's all these minor minutia guys. Grand Moff Tarkin is kind of the only representative we have of the cruel, indifferent governance of a fascist state. The militarized, singular, cold, sociopathic perspective. I think because of that, we get a different sense of what the Empire really is. When Andor Season 2 debuted, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the depiction of assault in the series. And one specific YouTuber, Star Wars Theory, went on many videos, many discussions about how it felt against what Darth Vader would want. That the depiction of assault in Andor was against, somehow, the idea that Vader represented. Because we sympathize to a degree with Vader. We see his fall from grace, his descent into darkness, and his redemption ultimately. We know at heart Vader as a person is a good man. He's just corrupted by darkness, rage, and his own depression, his own self-hatred. But because Vader is the representative of the Empire, we may get a false sense of what the Empire really is. We may think Vader is the omnipresent force in the Empire, that it all comes back to him. Yes, I know the Emperor is the main figurehead of the Empire, but through the depiction of Darth Vader as this grand figure that is the heavy for the Emperor, we get a false sense of what the Empire actually is about. Andor and Rogue One recenter it on the fascist structure of the Empire. We see the propaganda machine. We see how migrants are treated under the Empire. We see how a massacre exists just to mine a resource from a planet. People are treated like a commodity, or in some cases like an obstacle. That the very presence of society that exists on its own is something that has to be overcome. The whole thing with Gorman is that the Gormans are living on a planet that has this massive resource that Krennic needs to build the Death Star. And he just needs that resource. That's all he needs. And the easiest way to get it is to just mine the planet. Well, how do you mine it without people being upset? Well, you get rid of everyone living there first. And we see the fascist propaganda machine turn people against Gorman first, isolating them as a people, before using systems of authority and control to justify the massacres enacted. The massacre scene at Gorman is so cleverly done because it is structured very realistically. It's presented as a riot that is being influenced through PSYOP operations, the Empire sending false information to the rebels and the resistance groups to make them protest in public in a certain area, setting them up where they can frame these protesters as violent and unhinged before enacting a violent massacre on these people who essentially did nothing wrong but are ready to fight if need be, because they're aware that they are already a target. They know they have to defend themselves, but by framing it as though they're the aggressors rather than those defending and fending off the Empire is able to spin the massacre in its own favor. And while some can recognize this for what it is, a lot don't, especially given the emotional sentiment that people did die on the Empire's side. And everyone seems to know someone who works for the Empire. Everyone knows someone who works for the government. So they have a personal connection. They lost someone, whereas this isolated people that no one in the grander Empire or Coruscant or whatever knows, well, they can lose as many people as they want. There's no emotional attachment. They're the other. They're no longer a person. The banality of the Empire is exposed in Andor in a way it's very clever. We see these structures of power and control where a lot of petty, small people just seek more power. Whether that's power over an individual they can torture or dominate, or the influences of power in terms of cutting down a person above them in rank to kind of get that accountability, get that responsibility. A rat race that ultimately leads nowhere, because no matter how much you rise up the corporate ladder of the Empire, you're never getting above Emperor Palpatine. You're never getting above that level. You're never getting above Darth Vader. Grand Moff Tarkin is always above you. Krennic is always above you. And the rank goes down and down, where each person is fiercely protective of their power and looking like an authority, only for them to be undermined by a bigger force, ultimately.
Be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director.
I think it's very telling how, if we take Andor and then Rogue One as one continual narrative, every single figure of the Empire is taken down essentially by either their own failure or someone else cutting them down in authority. But there is an exception to this, and that's Syril.
Who are you?
Syril as a character is very interesting, I think, because he essentially is the pathetic toady of Andor. He is a loser who has a non-important position of power, fails his way upwards, and is used as a convenient tool for others to advance their own careers. He is meticulous with his appearance, meticulous with how he conducts himself, how he controls himself. He is always aware that every opportunity can bring him a little step forward in the Empire. But he still is pissed off at Andor, a figure who was his first, essentially his first failure was because of Andor in the Empire. He fell from grace because of Andor. And while he was able to eventually reclaim a position of power, he never lets go of that sense of frustration with Andor. He's always in pursuit of him at some level. Meanwhile, we find out Andor doesn't even know who this guy is. He's just another faceless cog in the machine of the fascist regime of the Empire.
Who are you?
And so, when they finally confront each other again, Syril is using Andor as a conduit for all his self-hatred. He blames himself to an extent for what's happening at Gorman. He feels like he was used by the Empire and by Dedra to enact this agenda that's hurting people, that's causing great harm. And he's left horrified, with the only channel of his rage being this guy he pins all of his frustrations on. Again, fascist institutions focus on redirecting our own anger towards a situation, towards ourselves, towards someone else. A better way to control the needs that you have. And by doing that, the Empire is using Syril essentially as a means to attack any obstinate forces, that in case being the Rebel Alliance. Meanwhile, Andor has no idea who this guy is. He is another cog in the Emperor's regime. When Andor asks, like, who are you? It stuns him. It stuns Syril because he has no idea how to answer that question. He spent all this time hating Andor, and Andor didn't even know who he is. In a lot of ways, that's very similar to the means through which the actual fascist regimes function. The average person who resists fascism is almost always more remembered than those who enact the fascist agenda, whatever that agenda might be. Star Wars has always been focused on this couple big guys in the Empire. But all the little guys get ignored. They kind of get lost to the shuffle because they're not really that important in the vast scheme of things. But we still remember them. There's still some characters who see it on occasion in the original trilogy. Like, oh yeah, that guy, he was in the background in Empire. Now he's back in Return of the Jedi. What's he doing here? You know, who knows? It's like all these character actors we recognize, but we don't really remember their names. I mean, I know they have names, they have lore in the Star Wars wiki or whatever, but like no one really knows who they are unless you're like a hardcore Star Wars fan. Casual audience also doesn't care who they are. They care about Darth Vader because he's cool and powerful and has an interesting arc that's divorced from the Empire, where he eventually turns against the systems of control he himself tried to push. But I think it's very interesting how with Andor we now focus on those little guys, all fighting for control over matters that seem very petty, but also very realistic. Star Wars, up until this point, I feel has never really felt like a real world. It's always felt a little artificial, because they're the spacecraft and the lasers and the Force and all that, and it's mystical and grandiose, and it's centered on a few families having this massive impact on the greater scheme of the universe. But the problem is ultimately that because it's this greater scheme, because it's this greater, larger thing, we never really stop to think, well, what about everyone else? What about the normal people who fight and die for the rebellion? What about the people who are piloting these TIE fighters, who are managing these weird office jobs under the Empire? Because society has to keep going on. Star Wars, the original trilogy, is more focused on these outskirt planets. We see Tatooine, which is basically a den of scum and villainy at times. We see Hoth, a big winter planet. We see Dagobah. We see all this other stuff. But we rarely ever see just a normal city like we do in the prequels. The original trilogy is very removed from tangible society. As a result, each of the places in Star Wars feels more like a fantasy landscape rather than a real place people can live in. Andor took the opposite approach. Most of it is spent looking at villages, populated with people. We get the sense of Coruscant as a center of business just as much as a center of the Empire or the Republic's actions. We get a sense of how ordinary people live their lives while functioning within the Empire. And that's important because that grounds the systems of control that we're now seeing in Star Wars. Previously, these systems of control were very nebulous. They were very nondescript. But now we see that they are a very elaborate system of control. That these are very elaborate ways that it influences every component of your life. And it's universal. It is universal. I know a lot of people will say, oh, it's this country or it's that country, but really it's a universal kind of thing. Because when you break it down, authoritarian rulership often functions in the same way almost every time.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
The prequels are an example of a series of movies with great ideas but poor execution.
Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!
In the prequels, we watch as Emperor Palpatine rises to power not through force. He doesn't overtake the Republic. He integrates himself in the Republic for the long game. Over the course of decades, he slowly establishes his control, chips away at the checks and balances to suppress his power, and uses public influence and propaganda to turn the public and the systems of control that he's now completely all in control of in order to attack any obstacles to his rule.
The Republic will be reorganized into the first galactic empire.
He uses the Jedi as a scapegoat to gather more power, turning a republic into an empire in order to stop a military coup, or at least a military coup as perceived by the public. PR is very important throughout Star Wars. Democracy falls not so much through the actions of some military force that conquers the republic, but rather with thunderous applause as the empire becomes a replacement for the system of power previously established. In a lot of ways, it is similar to ancient Rome. With the death of Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar revamped the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire as a means to maintain a stronger sense of control, to reduce the threat of public personas and public figures being attacked by an unruly Senate that will rebel even through violence if necessary. It's that interesting concept that Star Wars explores. It doesn't explore it well in the prequels, in my opinion, and it doesn't do so because we never get a sense of how the average person sees the Republic, how the average person sees the Senate or the Jedi. The Jedi are living in a lofty little apartment complex overlooking all of Coruscant, essentially. They're in the Jedi Temple, but the temple is so far removed. The cars that drive around the Coruscant in the prequels, they're set dressing. They're not really there to move characters we care about from place to place. They're props to visually demonstrate a bustling city, but unlike, say, Isaac Asimov's Foundation, we never get a sense of how the city functions as a city. We never get a sense of how the average person might live, how often they see the sunlight, if there's structures beneath the ground which they live in. Andor is interested in that. And because it's interested in that, we see more how the average person experiences propaganda, how it influences their worldview.
I'm not buying Gorman again. I'm sick of it. They were always too good for the rest of us.
Syril's mother's a great example of this. How, through the anti-Gorman propaganda, they're able to manipulate her into seeing certain people as undesirables in society, and she is played like a string when Syril dies and she's heartbroken over it. We see a sense of why the average person would not want to rebel in the Empire.
Propaganda. Mother, you're being sold these ideas.
My poor boy. Your gullibility is breathtaking.
We get a sense of why the average person would align themselves with an institution that we are told throughout all these other films is a system of pure evil. In the sequel trilogy, we watch at a certain point where the First Order does have a more aggressive approach on the New Republic. In The Last Jedi, they send a distress signal out at their last stop at Crate, and not a single person responds to the distress signal. The Resistance is left hopeless because no one is coming to save them. I remember the complaint when The Last Jedi came out was, why is no one going out to save them? Why would no one go out to help the Resistance fight the First Order?
They send a desperate signal for help out into the galaxy and pray that some Resistance sympathizers respond. They even use Leia's personal code. But, spoiler alert, no one comes. This makes no sense for a couple reasons. First of all, why would Resistance sympathizers not show up? If this really is the Resistance's final stand, then why was everyone else just sitting on the sidelines? And second of all, if they didn't come the first time that the Resistance called, why the heck did they come the second time in The Rise of Skywalker? It feels to me like the mentality would have been something along the lines of, well, we didn't go last time and they were fine. We probably can skip this one out and they'll live.
Well, it's because they're content. The reality is, as we see with Andor, people can live in the Empire. They can function. If they keep their head down and don't cause any trouble, they're not the active targets of the Empire at that moment. We see how the Senate, when Gorman is attacked, and they watch one of their own senators, the Senator of Gorman, getting arrested, they comply immediately. They bend the knee and they just echo the Emperor's statements. They echo the sentiments against Gorman because it's easier to go along with a system of power that isn't actively hurting you. But the reality is, we know from the very first film, A New Hope, that the Senate will be dissolved before the Battle of Yavin.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
All of these senators will be targeted and dismantled as part of an erosion of the Old Republic. Because with the Death Star, they have no need for the illusion of control.
Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station.
The Senate only exists to create an illusion that the people do have influence, that they can choose a replacement leader for an old one to represent their star system. But in reality, the Empire is only using that as a stopgap, as a temporary measure, until they get the Death Star to properly establish a sense of authority. You can't fall out of line not because your representative is here trying to fight for you. You can't fall out of line because if you don't obey the laws of the Emperor, a giant machine in space the size of a moon will come down and blow up your planet. It's a simple, over-the-top measure, but the idea of force as a means of control is a big one. And a lot of fascist regimes eventually lead to that after the illusion of control that people have no longer poses value to the positions of power at hand. But ultimately speaking, the Emperor comes for everyone. The Empire destroys those who help maintain it, to allow new faces to come in. It's like old teeth wearing down and a new one comes out, like a shark's teeth. There's a new, almost interchangeable replacement for everyone, and once you've outlived your usefulness, you will be discarded like you were nothing at the first slip-up. Meanwhile, in Star Wars, the rebels mess up all the time. They make mistakes, they fail, and while these failures sometimes cost them dearly, they can still keep fighting. There's always hope for a better tomorrow. Whereas in the Empire, every individual component has a lifespan, and when that lifespan is exhausted, they are gone and interchangeable with the next in line. We don't care who the various people running the Empire are in Star Wars, because none of them really stand out. They are just like the Stormtroopers, identical, meaningless, interchangeable. And I think what Star Wars has really done is illustrate how our perceptions of them as interchangeable really feeds into how feudal everything the individual empire people do. You know, all the imperial agents and officers, they are interchangeable to us as audience members, but to them it's a career with glory and value. Meanwhile, in the movies, they're gunned down in seconds. No one cares. No one even thinks about them. No one cares that Grand Moff Tarkin was blown up with the Death Star and all of his crew members. There used to be like a joke with Star Wars fans. I think Kevin Smith was the reason why.
The second time around, it wasn't even done being built yet. It was still under construction. So a construction job of that magnitude would require a hell of a lot more manpower than the Imperial Army had to offer. I bet they brought independent contractors in on that thing.
All right, so they bring in independent contractors. Why are you so upset at its destruction?
All those innocent contractors brought in to do the job were killed. Casualties of a war they had nothing to do with.
This started where it's like, what about all the independent contractors in the Death Star? What about all those guys? Well, they're also victims of the Empire, essentially.
And speaking as a roofer, I can tell you roofer's personal politics comes into play heavily when choosing jobs. Any contractor working on that Death Star knew the risk involved. If they got killed, it's their own fault. A roofer listens to this, not his wallet.
Now, Kevin Smith's gag was, what about the independent contractor who put, like, such and such, the big vent in the Death Star? Well, we know who that guy is now, Galen Erso, thanks to Rogue One. We humanize them. We know what his motivation is. We know that he died with the hope that his little imperfection in the Death Star would lead to its ultimate destruction.
I made myself indispensable, and all the while, I laid the groundwork for my revenge.
That the means of undermining the Empire came from rebels working within it, which led to all this grander stuff. Now, in the original trilogy, Death Star plans are already got. We have them already. But with the Andor into Rogue One story arc, we see the events that led to those plans being collected, as well as the human sacrifice and human toll to undermine the threat of the Empire. The story of grand heroes and all that, that's all well and good. There's a human cost to every success. A lot of failure led to success. Meanwhile, with the Empire, every single person there, every officer, succeeds and succeeds until they don't, and their failure is erased. It erases them, it unpersons them. They are no longer meaningful outside of a vague general statement about the human cost of that got us to this point. They don't matter. They're not human. They're human, but they're not human. In that their humanity barely matters to the system of authority that they are establishing. They are not human. They are a cog. If even that. They are a mechanism that can be switched out and replaced to no greater loss. A while back, one of my first videos was comparing Star Wars to Dune, and I said there that Star Wars is not great science fiction. And all the comments were like, oh, it's actually fantasy, actually. You get what I'm trying to say. It's not great as a collective compared to Dune, which I think of as great science fiction, as this great story of fanaticism, of the way that belief can drive people to do horrible things. Paul Atreides becomes a figure, a messiah, the Kwisatz Haderach, Muad'Dib. And in doing so, he becomes a figure of revolution. But from there, he leads his holy crusade, his jihad, to the stars, which leads to billions upon billions of deaths, upon planets being razed to their cores, of massacres. And in the second book, Dune Messiah, Paul Atreides even acknowledges how he has made an amateur out of someone like Hitler.
Paul unseats the Emperor and restores the name Atreides. But something terrible has been set in motion. And in truth, terrible things have already been done on Arrakis. The Fremen had been manipulated into following a man who allowed them to believe he was God when he was not. Over the course of the next 12 years, the Fremen culture withers and degrades. Many of those who followed Paul have now turned against him. The people of the Imperium beg for a constitution, but Paul rejects any constitution. Nothing may override his power. He allows nothing to limit his imperial will. At this time, all but a fraction of the human universe existed under Paul's rule. Paul clings to his empire out of fear of what is to come, hoping to save himself. He knows that he must act but doesn't, even though he is the only one who can. Paul had seen the jihad too late and failed to prevent the death of billions of innocents. But the jihad was a mere fraction of what was to come.
People were offended, were upset with Paul Atreides when reading that book. They couldn't believe that their hero from the first book would become such a monster, even though the whole book leads to that. The first book of Dune is all about how power and influence can lead to destruction.
The other path held long patches of gray obscurity, except for peaks of violence. He had seen a warrior religion there, a fire spreading across the universe with the Atreides green and black banner waving at the head of fanatic legions drunk on spice liquor. Gurney Halleck and a few others of his father's men, a pitiful few were among them, all marked by the hawk symbol from the shrine of his father's skull.
How even revolution of a good kind can ultimately pave the way to worse evils down the road. We see how Paul's name becomes a killing word, as he puts it himself. The reason why Star Wars, I feel, doesn't succeed the same way Dune does is that Dune focuses on the average person. We see how belief intrinsically impacts every component of life. We see how the people of Arrakis function in that society and how Paul's influence and the Lady Jessica's influence changes their day-to-day life. Dampness becomes a commodity when it was once a treasure. And it's very interesting, I think, how Dune tackles this versus how Star Wars used to tackle this. Because Star Wars wasn't really interested in how the Empire influenced the average person. It was more interested in the kings and queens. Yes, we see the Empire's acts of violence, but their violence enacted on a personal level. We see Luke's aunt and uncle killed. We see Obi-Wan killed. We see the threat of a planet blowing up. But we don't see how the Empire's architecture, its structure, can lead to senses of control. How the person can just live their life. How they watch galas, meanwhile people are being massacred in the streets on another planet, but it's away from them. It's somewhere else. It doesn't really matter to them. Andor has fixed that. Andor has illustrated to us, finally, why the Empire is not something to be admired or think is cool. It's a petty, small system of minutiae that controls.
The Imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks.
And I think that's what was missing from Star Wars all this time. Even the sequel trilogy, which drew heavily from neo-Nazi groups when depicting the First Order, it still presented uncertainty of how the First Order as a government functioned. What was life like living under the First Order? We get vague allusions with Finn and the other ex-stormtroopers, but we never get a sense of how living in this world means anything, how it functions, how you work in it, how you exist in it. Because that was very important. They wanted the cool space fights, they wanted the cool experiences, and to make room for the cool, they put away the horrific, they put aside the pain. And even the prequels, even though it focuses so much on politics, it's just words to the average viewer. We see a bunch of senators talking in a big meeting hall, and they talk about these vague things about a vote of no confidence and all that. Who cares? What human element does it tie in with? We see Padme and Anakin rolling and frolicking around in big fields and the lovey-dovey music playing, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff, but we don't see how the Trade Federation on Naboo affects the average person. We see empty buildings with patrols of droids around. We don't see how the average life is affected and impacted by these decisions. And as a result, we lose track of why the Empire needs to be stopped. If we lose track of the human cost of the systems of control, we lose a sense of why any of this even matters at all. And as a result, the whole thing suffers. We lose track of what matters in this world. And I think that's a thing that we need to remember. Because ultimately, storytelling requires the human narrative. We need to see where the people experience and what the people live through. I want to go back to the scene with Bix in Andor Season 2 where she is assaulted by an Imperial officer for a second, because I think that illustrates the casual cruelty of the Empire all in one sitting. And the reaction therein, we got a mix of reactions. A lot of reactionaries either brushed aside the scene that happened and moved on, or they focused on how they couldn't believe that anyone in the Empire would do that because Vader wouldn't abide by it. Vader wouldn't allow it.
And it has mainly galvanized around a tweet created by YouTuber Star Wars Theory, who I have many, many thoughts on, none very positive. But in his tweet, he said, SA in Star Wars feels unnecessary. You can portray power dynamics and make the audience hate the Empire in other ways without taking it to such a disgusting place. Vader wouldn't tolerate that shit, nor does the Empire condone it. It has no place in Star Wars, period. Unnecessary. There's a few things that are kind of ridiculous right on its face. I mean, his first thing that he says is Vader wouldn't tolerate that shit, nor does the Empire condone it. And it just goes to show his kind of ignorance of how these systems would actually work. Why would Vader give a crap what some guy on some backwater planet on a power trip is going to do?
And a lot of people point out, why would Vader matter? Myself included in that too. I would say, why would Vader matter in this decision? It's a single person who has power, given a place where no one's around, and he can act out his fantasies as he sees fit. The people working in the Empire are not Vader. They're not guided by this higher ideology. They are there because they are small, petty people who want to look strong and hold a position of power over someone else. And Andor illustrates that. At every level of the Empire, you have a person who is cutting for more power, pushing for more power, trying to undermine someone else to get a little bit of power in the system. And as a result of that, we see how the House of Cards falls apart. There's camaraderie among the rebels. There is a sense of hope and safety. They're fighting for each other, to protect each other, to protect what they love, to bring about change that makes people live in peace and happiness. Whereas the Empire, they are fighting all for themselves. And as such, when push comes to shove, they fall by themselves. It's amazing how in Rogue One, Krennic is killed because the Death Star, the thing he built, is activated and blows up his world as a test. The whole place that he's at, he's blown up, erased, gone, disappeared, unpersoned. There's nothing left of him. And, frankly, no one notices. The movies go on, nothing stopped. Just because the Death Star exists does not mean that Krennic mattered at all. But the influence of those who died bringing Death Star plans, that does matter. Their sacrifice leads to the events of the Battle of Yavin, which kickstarts the entire Star Wars saga as we know it. The sacrifices of those who wish to bring about change for others is valued throughout Star Wars, whereas those who fight for themselves, for a little bit of power, they are erased and forgotten. In much the same way, this is true for real systems of fascism and power. No one cares about the individual SS officers in the Nazi regime. They are forgotten about. They kind of blend together in the history books as interchangeable figures, but the heroes who fought them stand out historically. They're the ones who remain relevant. You probably don't know who Ernst Röhm is, but you know who Oskar Schindler is. Because Schindler sacrificed something, helped save people, helped have an influence outside to resist, to fight. Röhm is famous mainly for, serving Hitler until it was no longer necessary, and he was publicly humiliated and ultimately slain. He became a casualty of a system he helped establish. In much the same way, the various Imperial officers in Star Wars exist for a time, and then the moment they are no longer useful are cast aside. That illustrates more to anyone else the sheer cruelty of the Empire. Because it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter how much you accomplish, it doesn't matter what you do to help the cause. Once you're no longer useful, once you've built your Death Star and you've completed the project, you could be dismissed in seconds and no one's going to care. No one's even going to have a second to think about you. That's how it is. That's how these systems of control work. And what Andor does is illustrate the banality, the banal cruelty of these systems. So consider that before you dress up as a stormtrooper. Consider that before you talk about how cool the Empire is, how cool the Star Destroyer is and all that. It's essentially a system built not on individuality, but on how a person can be used as a resource to build a system of power that glorifies one central figure.
So it was a very anti-authoritarian, very kind of 60s against the man kind of thing, nested deep inside of a fantasy.
Or a colonial, we're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats that don't know nothing.
That's right.
And it was the same thing with the Vietnamese.
Yep.
The irony of that one is in both of those, the little guys won.
Right.
And the big, highly technical empire,
The English Empire. Right.
English Empire, the American Empire, lost.
Yeah.